We're live.
Okay. All right. Good evening. We are going to go ahead and call our Clarke County School District Board of Education work session to order at 6:05. We'll start with a roll call. Dr. Thomas, if you would conduct our roll call for us.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Davis,
Here.
Mr. Stevens, Mr. Stevens, Mr. Stevens,
I see him logged on, but I can't see his face. Let me see.
He's muted.
He's muted.
okay, Miss Davis,
Oh, he just
Here.
unmuted.
Dr. Yeager,
Here.
Dr. Dykeman,
Here.
Mr. Worthy,
Here.
I know he's here because I've been talking to him. Mr. Worthy,
Here.
Dr. Gant,
Here.
Dr. Knox,
Here.
Dr. Maddox.
Here.
Do you all still see Mr. Worthy?
Yes.
Yeah, I answered. You didn't hear me?
No.
No, sir, we couldn't hear you.
You hear me now?
Yes, sir.
I heard Anton's voice also. Did you hear it?
Yes, Antoine seems to be on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. We'll move forward with item number 2 on the agenda, which is to amend and or adopt the agenda. I'll open the floor for a motion for either.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion to adopt our agenda as is and a second. Are there any questions or further discussion? Okay. All in favor, Dr. Thomas, if you would do just a roll call for us, all of those in favor of adopting our agenda as printed.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Stevens,
Yes.
Miss Davis,
Yes.
Dr. Yeager,
Yes.
Dr. Dykeman,
Yes.
Mr. Worthy,
Yes.
Dr. Gant,
Yes.
Dr. Knox,
Yes.
Dr. Maddox.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. We'll move forward with items under number 3, first starting with our SPLOS monthly report. Are there any additional questions or discussion points, Dr. Thomas or board members, for this item?
I do not have anything additional.
I did not find anything to further discuss.
Okay. All right. I don't see any other individuals looking like they have any comments, or I don't see any chats. So we'll move forward with our Early Head Start Policy Council.
I do have a question, Madam President. Is the agenda, am I in control how big it is?
I don't think so. You can probably, I've tried to make it bigger on my screen, but I just have another screen sitting by me that just has the agenda.
There he is. Greg, if you go to view options.
Okay.
And the very first choice is like zoom ratio.
Yes.
Take that up to like 150% and it'll be more legible, but you won't see all of it. So it's, you know,
Okay.
more legible, but you see less of the screen, and then that becomes kind of. You can move it around with if you use your cursor, but that's kind of annoying too. Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Our early Head Start report, are there any questions or discussion points?
I didn't see any questions in that report though, but I did see an agenda item later to look at approving, I think it was a recommendation for a grant. So I didn't see that application anywhere. Is that something that I missed as a part of the report, or is it a separate item? It was I think it was a COVID type.
And so the report that you have present in front of you is actually a previous month's report. So the COVID application will come in as a portion of the following report. Okay. And the COVID dollars is one of the two. We have the annual approval to apply for the annual grant, and you have the approval to apply for the COVID dollars and supplemental funds. And that is a grant that's offered to Head Starts through the CARES Act, and will be utilized for some PPE and items that would help us with ensuring that our environment is safe for children to re-enter.
That's a later agenda item, is it not?
Yes, ma'am.
Totally. Okay, great. I can wait until then. Thank you so much.
No worries. Happy to be of service.
Okay, great.
Other questions or areas for discussion? Okay. We'll move forward. I didn't have anything under my the Career Academy report or the Parent Advisory report, and I would imagine at least with one of those items because of our current circumstances, but Dr. Thomas or others?
That's correct. We have not met. I've spoken to Mr. Boyd once since we have been out, but we have not had a face-to-face meeting. Neither has the Career Academy. I did receive a communication from them yesterday that due to the current circumstances, had some members that were supposed to come off of their board, and they were also supposed to change leadership, but they have agreed to leave the current leadership in place until we're able to come back together and then make some decisions moving forward. And that leadership is in terms of their board chair and vice chair.
Okay, and so I imagine they'll update us with.
Yes, ma'am. And they did an official vote for that. And I wish I remember, I'm sorry, Dr. Gann, I can look it out, look it up.
That's okay.
Extension on how long they were extending those officers, but they did extend throughout this pandemic, and they were not going to make the change at the predetermined time.
Okay.
They have already elected those officers, have they not?
According to the email that I received, they have extended C.J. Amerson and Christy Terrell as co-chairs for an additional year. So based on that, I'm assuming that they had not elected other officers, that they were supposed to do that this spring.
Okay.
And not rolling off I think it's maybe 5 to 6 board members that are now going to stay on.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, we'll move forward with the board president's report. And I have a couple of items that I wanted to mention, one of which may require some additional discussion, but I'll start with the ones that hopefully will not. One is I just wanted to, I know that we all have had an opportunity to look at the cognitive report, read through it several times, and hopefully also begin to think through and brainstorm the implications for the report and those things that we need to either change or modify. And so I did just want to let you know that I am in the process, along with Dr. Thomas and Dr. Maddox as well, of trying to think through and put together at least a path or a plan forward. And so wanted to ask you to be on the lookout or open to, at least if I need to reach out to you, and or one of us needs to reach out to you and ask you to either follow up on something or clarification or your thoughts about something. I'm thinking particularly with like committees and committee chairs, and I know policy from attending that meeting. There are implications for different areas that we're in the process of putting together. And I hope to be able to share, we'll share a little bit more of that next week. I think it'll probably overlap some with Dr. Thomas's report around some of the ways in which we're trying to organize our path forward and the steps that we'll need to take. I also just wanted to let you know as well that part of that work will be reaching out to GSBA and trying to put together a professional development calendar, which is something we've mentioned many times before. And so just, it's more of an FYI. I didn't want you to think I was sort of out here hanging out and reaching out to GSBA, but that is something that, from my understanding, has been one of our one of the things that we decided to do as a board. And so I do think it's appropriate to reach out to them to see ways in which they may be able to support as it relates to professional development. And then one of the things that Dr. Thomas has done, and I don't know if she'll talk about this tonight or next week or what have you, but she's had her cabinet basically organize all of the directives by way of the actual standard that they are referencing for the board, and not just for the board, but for the school district as well. Lining those alongside, well, the standard, the overall sort of report and narrative for that particular area, and the directives. And then that way, any steps that we take forward, we're actually able to align them with the specific directive and the specific standard that we're addressing. Let's see. There will also, I think several of us received I think most of us received an email today. And so wanted to let you know that at some point we'll need to talk about like when a particular group requests to meet with the board, not how to respond to that, because our policy actually addressed that. It says that it'll be added to our next available agenda, but that is something we'll need to discuss in the near future, because there was a request to meet with individuals or to meet with the board. And then my last item has to do with, I know that there's been a lot of, there have been a lot of conversations around an incident or an experience that happened at the African American Read-In. And there have been some concerns around that incident regarding the impact, as well as the appropriateness, as well as like how we forward as a board. And so I did want to carve out a little time during the president's report during this work session to talk about that. And I'll start with Mr. Davis. But certainly if there are any other questions or any other thoughts that individuals want to share, please feel free to share those. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Madam President. I made an error in judgment when I read the Langston Hughes poem, Ku Klux, at the African American read-in at Greater Bethel Church on February 23rd. Regardless of my efforts to celebrate a great African American poet, many in the community were emotionally harmed by my reading of the N-word used in the poem. I should have known better than to use such presidential language. Langston Hughes was a poet of the Harlem Renaissance who sought to expose both the subtle and the blatant aspects of racism. Though I have read his poems since childhood, I am a person who has greatly benefited from white privilege and thus not entitled to interpret the body of his work, irrespective of the language, dialect, or subject matter. Consequently, I seek to use reflection and prayer to better understand the insensitive assumptions behind my reading of the poem, to use readings and dialogue to better understand how racist ideology has impacted my thinking, and to actively support the struggle for both equality and equity in the Athens, Clarke County community. Thank you.
Are you looking for scissors?
Mr. Davis, are there any follow-up either comments or discussion points that are
yes,
to share at this time?
yeah.
Mr. Worthy?
Okay, I had emailed you earlier.
Mr. Worthy, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, going in and for some reason. But anyway, I had emailed you earlier this week because I received a number of calls about this, as you stated earlier, and wanted to put this on the agenda. And rather than go into a discussion about this, we as a board got to address that we are not following our policy BH under code for our board members. In fact, we were cited in that cognitive report for not doing that. And some board members were inconsistent in terms of being familiar with that policy. So we need to follow that policy and not making a motion tonight, since I talked to you earlier this week about having that item on the agenda. Because we're not to get into, well, I guess we can make motions tonight to go ahead and put that on the agenda as an action item and follow the policy in terms of what we're supposed to do when something like that happened with a board member. Did you get all of that?
I heard a good bit of it. The first part I didn't. But in essence, what I think I hear you saying is that this issue it's an issue under our BH policy, and it indicates that we're not following our policy under board code of ethics. I've read through this, and I guess I'm just trying to get a better understanding of where specifically under BH does it, what are we not following under BH?
If you look at policy BH, it talks about the conduct of a board member. And I believe it's item 4 in terms of compromising the board and administrators. I don't have the policy before me, but I'm sort of maybe paraphrasing, but that's what we're supposed to do. But if you read further, we also supposed to bring this before the board to see whether we need a hearing on it. And according to some of the comments we're getting from the community, the same as that letter we received from the NAACP yesterday, that we need to follow that policy and address this situation, because I can tell you it's not going away.
Other thoughts?
John has his hand up.
Oh, okay. Dr. Knox?
Thank you. I don't have a comment. I just wanted to clarify, since I have the board policy up, what Mr. Worthy was talking about. So in policy BH, under the heading conduct as board member, point number 4 is, and I think we should just know what the wording is: take no private action that will compromise the board or school system administration. So that, just so we've got that on the record, that's what Mr. Worthy was indicating.
That's correct.
Okay.
I do see that. I guess my question specifically is, in our board policy, we do not have, let me say this, I am not aware of, I don't see in our code of ethics where there is a process outlined for what we do, and neither do we have norms right now. And so when we talk about the conduct as a board member and take no private action that will compromise the board or the system, while I think we can all agree, or most of us might agree on what that is, there's still a level of subjectivity there.
But if you continue to read, you'll see that you can have a hearing with the board when something of that sort happens. Let's continue to read. And you mentioned norms. Norms don't have anything to do with this. That's already in print.
I'd like to also add, I've received calls about this same concern, and the sentiments are exactly what Mr. Worthy has said too. The people that have contacted me are concerned that we will not follow our policies. And so if we have a policy that says we have a hearing, or we have this person talk to us and explain that, then I think that that's the policy that we should be doing. People have brought to my attention other situations where the use of this word had resulted in 2 high school students not being able to graduate. That's just how seriously it was taken by one state and one school system. And I think I've had a couple of other articles that have been mailed to me saying, you know, how can you sit there and allow this to happen? I appreciate your explanation, Mr. Davis. And again, the point is not so much that you made this explanation to us here today, but the fact is, if we did indeed and somehow put our district in jeopardy in terms of showing a bias or an insensitivity, then it calls for something more than reflection. It calls for us to do something differently. And that's the conversation that I would like for our board to have around doing that. It's not a self-healing thing. I think that, again, it calls for something greater. And so I'm supporting Mr. Worthy and us having either going for a hearing on this or having it as an agenda item and fully discussing it so that everybody can go into their corners and pull out whatever they need to bring out. And let's move forward with getting this handled.
Dr. Knox?
Again, I'm not taking sides. I'm just making clear to everyone what the policy reads. So beneath conflicts of interest, the heading, then in the final paragraph is what Mr. Worthy was referring to. And so let me read that. Upon a motion supported by a 2/3 vote, the board may choose to conduct a hearing concerning a possible violation of this code of ethics by a member of the board. The board member accused of violating this code of ethics will have 30 days notice prior to a hearing on the matter. The accused board member may bring witnesses on his or her behalf to the hearing, and the board may elect to call witnesses to inquire into the matter. And it goes on about what would happen about a vote in terms of a violation of the code of ethics. So I'll stop there, but that's the process that Mr. Worthy was alluding to. And I just wanted to make clear it is present in policy BH. So I'm not taking sides. I'm just trying to, as a former policy committee chair. I just wanted to make sure that it is clear to everybody. There is a process for it, but the process requires a 2/3 vote of the board to even
Absolutely
kick
correct.
in. So
Thank you, Dr. Knox and Mr. Worthy, for highlighting that.
So I guess what
And I do stand corrected that it is there under, just not under a number, but I see exactly where you all are, what you all are referencing.
So can I just ask, Mr. Worthy, so what you're saying is that you'd like to start that process by making a motion and having a vote on whether the board would conduct a hearing? Is that what you're saying?
That is absolutely correct. And I would want this item to be moved down on the agenda for next week as an action item.
To take a vote.
Get started.
Okay.
Yes.
And if that's a motion, I will second that motion, that it be moved as an action item to the agenda.
Yes.
But is that something we would do at the beginning of the meeting next week to add to the agenda? Or
No,
not?
it will be added to the agenda.
We can do it tonight.
Okay.
Because as I said, I made that request earlier in this week. So all it has to be done.
I made that request by email several weeks ago.
No, and I know, and I remember the email. I also had the question of exactly what it was that the
It's the very act of the board determining by a 2/3 vote whether or not this warrants the board taking action. It's the same thing that we did before. If it is not the desire of the board, then nothing happens. But the board must vote publicly on whether or not to take action.
to have a hearing.
To have a hearing.
That's correct.
So it's two things here. Number one, while I do hear that, I know we have policy regarding how things are added to our agenda, and you're correct, Mr. Worthy, that you did bring this to our attention. I still think that the policy needs some more clarification regarding how things are placed on the agenda. So for instance, I read that in our policy that before that set amount of days to mean that if there's something specific we're requesting from from Dr. Thomas or the superintendent and staff. And so I know that we all sort of interpret that differently. But I do just want to say that because just placing things on the it's something that I think either we need to tighten up with policy, or there needs to be a more specific process, because a person can make a request a week, 2, 3 weeks to put something on the agenda, but that doesn't mean that it's going to benefit. That doesn't mean that it's going to be placed on the agenda, or that it even needs to be placed on the agenda. There have been a couple of things before where we've had these conversations about, wanting to put things on the agenda. So I just say that to say, I do think we need to take maybe a closer look at that aspect of the policy.
I'm not following what you're saying. The policy is clear.
What I'm saying, Mr. Worthy, is that what is clear to you is not clear to me.
What you have to follow what's in print.
That's all I'm saying. What is
to change something? You can't change that. You don't have the authority to deny a board
Mr.
member.
Worthy, I'm not going to argue with you, but I'm just simply making the points during the president's report that I do think that's an area that can be clarified a little bit more. Secondly, what I was going to say is that I also think that I know that we've had something like this on the agenda before, if I'm not mistaken, when we decided as a board about the formal process with Dr. Means. I think we also had it on there when we talked about Dr. Knox as well. And so I guess in essence, it's the same thing that you're requesting. be placed on the agenda.
That you are absolutely correct, and I am not arguing. I'm saying what's in print with the policy BC. If you want something to go on the agenda for the work session, you ask to place that on the agenda 7 days before the work session. And of course, if you wait until the regular board meeting, if the item is sensitive enough, you can also ask for it to be amended on the agenda. I'm following what's in print now. You can't change what's in print. That has to take place in policy committee meeting. We need to go ahead and address this situation with the action item next week.
Could I ask a question? And maybe Mike can chime in on it, but I know that there were situations previously when Jared was the president where people asked for things to be placed on the agenda, and he said that that was the job of the president and vice president and the superintendent
Right.
to set the agenda, and that if you want something placed on the agenda, that it would have to be done by a vote at the point where you amend the agenda. So I've heard, I mean, I see what you're saying in the where it says in the policy, but then I also remember that happening as well. So maybe we could get some clarification from Mike, maybe.
I'm not understanding what you all are saying. What you all are saying, you're not following what's in print in the policy. Now, if the policy is going to be revised, do that in the policy committee meeting. I don't see where it needs to be revised. It's crystal clear in terms of policy BC and policy in terms of adding something to the agenda for the regular meeting and also for the work session. I think Dr. Knox just pulled the policy up. I saw it popped up on the screen. Am I correct, Dr. Knox?
So BC reads, any request from board members or district administrators to have a presentation or a discussion item considered for the board work session, that would be what we're doing right now, must be submitted 7 days prior to the work session meeting. It just says to have it considered for the board work session. It doesn't guarantee it. Is that what you're saying, Kara?
Well, and then it goes on to say, in consultation with the president and vice president of the board, the superintendent will recommend board presentations and agenda items to be discussed at the board work session or in special situations at a regular or call meeting. And so that's what, when I say that, I think it just needs a little bit more clarity. I think it would be useful because we found ourselves at times wondering, okay, what can be placed on the agenda and who can it come from? And I think if this is a little bit clearer, then it sort of takes it away from the three of us just having to decide what's going to be on the agenda and what's not going to be on the agenda.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
I will also say that based on the dynamics of the board, I don't think it's any surprise. It is not a helpful practice to simply have someone in non-individual people wanting to or being able to simply place stuff on the agenda when there has not been any type of discussion or consideration of it. I think that can lead us down an unproductive path. Nevertheless, we're back at Mr. Worthy, your recommendation and Ms. Davis's, your motion and Ms. Davis's second about this item being placed on the agenda for next week to take action around whether there's been a violation of the Code of Ethics.
You're absolutely correct. That's policy BH.
Okay, any more discussion on that?
So do we have the vote right now or do we vote next week?
Mike, could you clarify?
Well, no.
From my understanding, I think we can simply vote to add it since this is the work session, but do you mind clarifying for me?
Sure. So the next paragraph after the two you just read is, in addition, agenda items may be added to regular meetings or call meetings of the board if the action required is time sensitive and approved by a majority vote of the board members present prior to the adoption of the agenda. So, I mean, it doesn't say whether that's got to be in the work session or the regular meeting. I would say it could be either one. So since you already have a motion and a second, I don't see anything wrong with going ahead and taking that vote tonight. If a majority approves it, then it's on the agenda for next week.
And to be clear,
That's an action item.
and to be clear, what's on the agenda for next week is the action item to vote on whether Mr. Davis's action were a violation or a hearing needs to take place. And there was a violation of our code of ethics. Is that correct?
That's how I understand it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so as well, that it would be a vote on whether or not we would hold a hearing. And in the hearing, it would be determined whether or not there was a violation.
No. Your vote tonight is just whether to
Right,
put it
right,
on the agenda next week.
Right, but we'd be
Right.
voting to put on the agenda for next week an action on whether or not we wanted to have a hearing.
And that will require a 2/3 vote to go forward with a hearing.
For it to be a hearing.
That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay, so tonight is about adding it to the agenda. Any other questions before we take a vote?
John has his hand up.
Okay, Dr. Knox.
Thank you. Just a couple of things real quick. First of all, I think it's been board practice over longer than my term for the leadership to set the agenda no matter what. Now, this really goes back before me, but I distinctly remember Greg having a heck of a time getting things on the agenda probably in 2016 when I attended meetings before I was ever on the board. So I think the interpretation of BC has been essentially recommendations from board members in the agenda. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That's just my impression of how it's played out. And there was reference to Jared Bybee when he was board president doing the same thing. And then the second thing is, Mike is correct to say that a majority vote is required for time sensitive. This is something that Cognia dinged us on, but they didn't go all the way down on the policy. Right below that, something like 4 lines below that time sensitive thing, it says that amendments to the agenda require a 2/3 vote. So although the Cognia report said that we didn't know our policies when we required a 2/3 vote to change the agenda, actually we did, but that policy is confusing to say the least. So I just wanted to put all that kind of procedural stuff on the table before we actually took a vote, because this goes right to the heart of one of the concerns Cognia had about our policies. We did know our policies, but our policies say 2 pretty similar things, but require different levels of vote for it.
Dr. Knox, let me chime in here. If you go back and read the Cognia report again, as I stated a few minutes ago, this is specifically what it said, that during the interviews, there were some board members, there was some inconsistency with them not being even familiar with policy BH. That's what it said. I don't recall reading everything that you said, pertaining to line by line, but I still say every board in this state and around this country, board members under a policy would have a right to ask to put an item on the agenda. Not just the president, the vice president, and the superintendent controlling that. That's not the democratic way of doing anything. In fact, the vice president didn't even attend those meetings with setting the agenda until I made president and said to them, this is not right. Have the vice president in here too, because if something happens to me and I can't attend, the vice president is already up to speed in terms of what to do. But that's not saying that those 3 people control the agenda.
If I could jump in as just get back to the procedure. Yeah,
Sure.
what Dr. Knox, and not getting into what Cogni report says or doesn't say, but just looking at the policies themselves, what Dr. Knox says is exactly right. That's always been confusing about 2/3 versus majority. I think, told you multiple times, it's my view that that next paragraph Dr. Knox referred to should be interpreted to say a 2/3 vote is required to amend the agenda after it has already been adopted. That's consistent with
Yes.
Robert's rules. It is written in such a way that that's confusing in our policy, and most, if not all the time, the board's taken the view it takes a 2/3 vote to amend it even before it's been adopted. But then how do you square that with the power to put a time sensitive matter on the agenda with only a majority vote? I don't know that I can bring any more clarity, but I'll just affirm that that is the confusion.
And barring all confusion, the issue at hand is, do we put this on the agenda so that we can at least put it to bed? It shouldn't be kicked around as long as we kick some other things around and avoidance. So we need to either go ahead and put it on the agenda or vote and say, you know what, we're not going to do anything. But again, we can't do anything until it hits the agenda. And so until we get on the agenda, I don't know that there's any more conversation about this.
All right, Dr. Knox, and then we will go ahead and take a vote whether we want it on the agenda.
That's fine. Just procedurally, it sounds like, based on what Mike said, that this vote should require only a majority to put it on the agenda, that's the best interpretation of a confusing policy. Is that correct, Mike?
That is correct. But again, you are correct that the board has acted differently in the past.
Given that this is something that we were dinged on by Cognia, I think the best interpretation here is what Mike said, which is that a majority vote here. I just want to make sure that if we take a vote, we actually know what the heck it means, because that otherwise it's just stupid. So I'll just put that out there to see if people nod or whatever. The vote we're about to take, if it's a majority, then it puts it on the agenda. Is that?
And I would ask, by the same token, since there has been inconsistency, the president can simply decide which one she wants, if it's going to be a majority or if it's going to take a quorum.
I think
that just becomes a part of the action of putting it on the agenda.
Based on what Mr. Pruitt has said and conversations, I think majority will be fine. But again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I do think this is a policy that needs to be visited as we move forward with, I
totally agree. I support
correcting the areas. And so, Dr. Yeager, if you would be sure just to make note of that. I think there are some policy implications, and I do think that this is one that needs to be clarified.
I have that on my list when I went through the Cogni report, that BH was definitely one for us to revisit.
I just heard BC. Are you
BC.
wanting to add
BC.
BH as well?
Well, BC, if we think BH is fine, I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing there's inconsistency in BH. Did I hear that? Or is that
with BH, there were and we can talk about this.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We'll talk about that at policy, but that is definitely one that I put on my list.
Yeah, and with BH, Ms. Davis, to your point, that was one of the ones that we were encouraged to review.
Right.
Our code of ethics, but I do think in addition to that, we also need to, take a look at our at BC as well.
That would be great.
Okay, we'll go ahead and, based on just the guidance that's been put forth, we'll take a vote. And again, the vote is whether or not this actually goes on the agenda for next week.
On the agenda as an action item.
As an action item. Excuse me. Dr. Thomas, if you would do a roll call for us, all of those, whether you're in favor or not, of placing this on our agenda for next week as an action item.
lost Dr. Thomas.
She's muted.
Dr. Thomas, I think.
Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Mr. Davis,
Yeah.
Aye.
Mr.
Yes.
Stevens,
Yes.
is that an aye or a nay? Yes, I can't hear you.
Aye.
It was a yes.
It was a yes. Okay, I couldn't
that a
hear. if it was
yes?
a- Okay, thank you. I couldn't hear what he was saying. Ms. Davis,
Yes.
Dr. Yeager,
Yes.
Dr. Dykeman,
Yes.
Mr. Worthy,
Yes.
Dr. Gant,
Yes.
Dr. Knox,
Yes.
Dr. Maddox.
Yes.
I think that was 9, all 9, Dr. Gant.
Okay.
That was unanimous.
Thank you. Okay, that is it. That's it for my report. I'll turn
Okay,
it over to you, Dr. Thomas.
thank you. I will start with something exciting and positive. Our senior class, as we all know, has really been faced with unprecedented challenges that no one would have expected. Several people have aligned this senior class with the group from the infamous 9/11, but we all know that we have felt deeply for these students and how their last year of high school has been disrupted. So I just wanted to share briefly some of the things we're doing to celebrate them. The district communications office has taken out advertisements in the Athens Banner Herald and Flagpole. It will list all students' names and have a congratulations from the school district there. We've also purchased 2 billboards that will be up around, one on the east side and one on the west side of Athens, celebrating our graduates. And we, the district office went in with our school principals and purchased yard signs for the 3 high schools. So that will be for Cedar Shoals, Clarke Central, and Classic City. So I know Clarke Central is passing those signs out tomorrow in a safe social distancing way. Students will stay in their vehicles, but they will have teachers out celebrating them and passing those signs out. So every student that is graduating in the class of 2020 will receive a yard sign with their name and graduation year and school colors on it. So that's just a couple of the things we're doing. We're going to have virtual graduations on May 22nd, and then the tentative face-to-face is still set for July 22nd. And we're sharing information with how they can create digital invites, some sample wording, because we sometimes assume that everyone has the same level of fluency in some skills that we do, and everyone's not big on doing virtual online invites. So I've asked our team to create a sample and get that out to principals tomorrow that they can share with families so that they can log on and be a part of those virtual ceremonies. So we're really excited about that. And next I have Mr. Gaskins. Our goal had been to try to provide you with some data, because while this last 2 months has kind of consumed all of us, we're still trying to maintain a focus on students and student learning. Ultimately, we are about academic growth and academic opportunity for all of our students, meeting our students where they are and giving them what they need so that they can improve. Mr. Gaskins is going to talk to you briefly tonight about the data that we have, recognizing that unfortunately we weren't able to do a true pre-post type data collection due to the disruption in the school year. He's also going to give you some instructions on how to access the dashboard, and we'll be working to ensure that we do refreshers periodically so that you all can access that. So Mr. Gaskins.
All right, thank you, Dr. Thomas. Ms. Palmer, if I could share the screen.
Certainly. Let's see.
I heard dashboard. I'm real happy.
Can you share it now?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Dr. Thomas. Good afternoon, board members. As Dr. Thomas said, we wanted an opportunity to share our current data with you. Unfortunately, we do not have our end of the year data because most of that most of those assessments will take place in April and in May. But I do want to walk you through the data that we currently have, which is mostly from December in the winter, and just explain to you how we will use this data and then show you all our data dashboard. And are you all seeing the PowerPoint? Okay, thank you. All right. So just to give you some context, overview of student achievement data, we have just 3 big buckets of data that we look at as a school district. Of course, classroom assessments, which includes classwork, projects, quizzes. We have some district required assessments, such as unit post assessments. The district required assessments that we'll take a look at today is our NWEA map, which is given in grades K through 8th grade. And then we have iReady, which is only used at ALPS and Gaines, which gives similar information. And then we also have our state mandated assessments. We have our Milestones end of grade assessment, which is for grades 3 through 8 in reading, language arts. And then at 5th and 8th grade, we also have science and social studies. And then we have our Milestones end of course assessments, which is for high school. So the NWEA MAP assessment and iReady, these assessments are assessments that really assess growth. So we do not use these assessments for proficiency, but we use them to show how students have grown from one assessment window to the next assessment window. So we give the MAP and iReady assessments 3 times a year, once in the fall when we come back to school to help teachers understand where students are. We give it again in the winter to see what growth our students have had in that first semester. And then we give it again at the end of the year so we can determine how students have grown throughout the year. So the chart that I have shows you proficiency. And so I would just caution you all that the MAP is not really used for proficiency, but because we have not and will not give the end of grade milestone assessment or our end of course spring assessment, we will use the MAP to kind of determine where our students are as we begin planning for next year. So in the winter, when you look at the English language arts, we had about 26% of our students that were considered on level or above. And in math, we had 24% of our students that were on grade level or above. Below the chart, we have the percentile of proficiency for each of our subgroups. So if you look at our English language arts, that was 12% of our Black students that were on level or above for ELA, 62% for our white students, 22% for our Hispanic students, 21% for our English learners, and then 7%, which is our SWD population, which stands for students with disabilities. If you look at our math MAP scores, again, 24% of all students on level or above. Black students, it was 10%, white students, 58%, Hispanic students, 22%, our English learners, 23%, and students with disabilities, 7%. So what is provided in the slide deck that we will make available to you all as a PDF is a little more information about each subgroup. So for example, I'll go over reading. This would be all students. It shows you the number of students that fall into each one of these categories. So for beginning, and this is ELA, that would be 2,262 students that would fall in the beginning level, which means they are not proficient. We have about 800 students that will fall into the developing category. And then the top 2 categories, proficient and distinguished, would represent those numbers of students that would fall into the proficient or higher categories. So this is just an example of all students. Also in the slide deck, for example, this would be the subgroup deeper dive for our African American Black students. So it would show you at each category, distinguished, proficient, developing, and beginning, the number of students in kindergarten through 8th grade that will fall into those categories. So again, we don't use the MAP assessment as the indicator for proficiency, because the MAP assessment is used for progress and growth, and it is an adaptive assessment. So if you're familiar with adaptive assessments, when a student takes an adaptive assessment, when they get a question correct, it gives them harder questions. When they get an assessment incorrect, they get easier questions. The way that the MAP assessment works is that if your test becomes more difficult, you are considered to be on level when you get half of those questions incorrect and half of those questions correct. So as it is getting harder and harder, it is trying to make sure that you can at least get half of the content that is presented to you correct. The other thing about the MAP assessment is the MAP assessment, it assesses on grade level standards, but depending on the number of questions that you get correct, it also assesses standards above your grade level and below your grade level. So this would be the example for our white students, and you'll have this information. This would be our example for our Hispanic students, our English learners, our students with disabilities. And then I would also have the information for our mathematics subgroups as well, which would be the same reports, different assessment, and it would show you the number of students that are making up each category. The other information that I wanted to share with you all, or Dr. Thomas and I wanted to share with you all, is our Georgia Milestones end of course assessments. So we do have some students that take the EOC in the fall. Most of our students take the end of course assessment in the spring, but we do have students that have accelerated a course, or we have students that have retaken a course that requires them to also retake the EOC. And so you will see that these scores are much lower than what we would usually have when we have the majority of our students take the assessment. So when you look at proficiency for our end of course winter results, for 9th grade Lit, it would be proficient 11%, American Lit 7%, analytic geometry. And in analytic geometry, the population of those students are students that are taking accelerated coursework. And that is why you see that proficiency rate is much higher. Coordinate algebra, those are usually students that have repeated a course. Biology, the same thing, students that have repeated a course. Physical science, economics, and US history. What we have also provided for you in the slide deck is a comparison. So I know it's hard to say, is 7%, is that good for this time? Is that not good for this time? It will show you the 2019-20, which is this year's kids that took it in December, compared to last year's kids that also took it in December. So what is very, I think, difficult about displaying this data, this does not represent the total number of students that would take this assessment. So American literature, we have hundreds and hundreds of students that would take that assessment. Based on the data in the fall, you would see that it is 42 students that took that assessment. So this doesn't represent what proficiency would look like if those students would have taken, or the rest of the students taken that assessment in the spring. But for all of those essential 8 end of course assessments, we have the comparison from the 2019-2020 school year compared to the previous year for your reference. Analytic geometry has gone up, coordinate algebra, biology, physical science, and economics. US history, so I know that was a really quick kind of dive into the data that we have so far. The other information that we want to share with you is that James Barlaman, who is our director of data and research, has updated what we think is a really user-friendly dashboard specifically for stakeholders and our board members to use. So I've shared this document with Dr. Thomas, and she will share this with you all hopefully later today or tomorrow, but I'll walk through it for you. It's an analytics site. You'll have these directions. You click on this link. I've already brought up the web page on my computer. We think it is very much more user-friendly than some of the dashboards that we used in the past. But this dashboard will show the data, our previous school year data. So for example, here's our end of grade data. So I would click on that. I can click on the subject. So this shows us an overview of the data for our entire district, but I can also drill down by school. So if I selected a school, I can see that school's specific data for each of those categories. It has a comparison of the school data compared to the state. It also has a comparison of the school related to Clarke County. So all of the schools in Clarke County that took that assessment. And then it also has the school's information. And then it has previous year's assessments as well. The other good information about this is that it has a category for our subgroups. So we can look at our subgroup information as well. We can look at gender. And we can also look at Lexile level, which is the student's reading level. There's information on the dashboard that relates to ACT, SAT scores. We have enrollment history, attendance.
I'm muting, yeah, I'm muting.
Dropout rate, graduation rate, all of these things are available for you to peruse. The other thing that I want to mention is that we do have some areas that are currently under construction. So our strategic plan indicators, we are under Dr. Thomas's direction, revising some of those indicators that we will present to the board. So this component is under construction. We have a quick link to the state's CCRPI score. The indicators of college and career readiness, that is also under construction. But we do have our school climate survey information that is available for you as well. So of course, I am available to help you navigate this. We think it's very intuitive and user-friendly. At the direction of Dr. Thomas, Mr. Barlaman or myself can walk you through a deeper dive of looking at the dashboard. but we're just here to help. So Dr. Thomas, I think that is what I have, but I will open it up for any questions from board members.
Dr. Yeager had asked, is there a way to, I think, see the number of students behind the percentages and then any error or uncertainty associated with the percentages? So Dr. Yeager, you may want to expound on that.
Well, that was my question. I find it frustrating, as you pointed out with your examples earlier on, when there's 4 students behind a percentage, the percentage is not very meaningful. And so when I looked at the dashboard, I don't know, it's been a few months now, the original dashboard we had in the fall, I find it kind of frustrating to just only look at percentages. And so I would love to be able to go see how many students are behind each of the data. And if there's an uncertainty error or some sort of estimate of certainty around these different numbers, is there a way to do that?
Dr. Yeager, are you referring specifically to the percentages that are in the dashboard?
Yeah.
Yes. So I will follow up with James Barliman. I know that we know those numbers because we basically he takes it from an Excel file to make the percentages and the visual display. So if that's something that we can't have readily available on our dashboard, that is something that we can definitely make sure that we can provide as an addendum to all of our board members in a separate file.
Yeah, forgive me, I'm a nerdy scientist, but an Excel file of data is much more informative to me than a dashboard that's got it all massaged and colorized.
Yeah. So you're like Mr. Barliman and myself. We like to look at Excel documents as well, but we know that that is sometimes difficult for someone that does not look at data every day. But we can provide that for you.
I appreciate the dashboard because the Excel spreadsheet will bury me and I will not come up for days. So yeah, thank you. I still want to know the numbers behind those percentages, though. That would be very helpful.
Janaz?
Yes.
This looks great. I like the amount of detail and the ability to drill down to schools. And so just for clarity, this is a different dashboard and a different company than the previous one was that we had, like, I think a year ago or so.
So yes, this is a different dashboard. We are not using a company. This is all Mr. Barliman building this from scratch. So he's done a lot of work behind the scenes. Mr. Barliman and I, we consulted with someone who is over data and research in Atlanta Public Schools, because they always pump out a lot of data and we wanted to know how they were able to do that. So he showed Mr. Barliman how to build that at a coffee shop one day. And Mr. Barliman spent about 2 to 3 months behind the scenes building this from scratch.
Okay. So I thought I saw the word Illuminate somewhere. It's not that company?
Well, he is pulling some of the information from Illuminate. So we have a lot of our stuff, it pumps into Illuminate, and then that's how he pulls multiple reports.
And so hopefully I'm not sure I know this, we're not paying that company that did the last dashboard. Are we still paying them?
So Dr. Thomas and I, as well as our cabinet, we have gone through and done a resource audit. So we realized that a lot of, not a lot, but some of the vendors that we are using are duplicating work that we can do ourselves. So we will not be using them in the future.
Good. If there are others that are being eliminated, I think it'd be good for the board to kind of have a list of what was eliminated, just so we know what's not being spent. That's as good as knowing what is being spent in some ways. Thank you.
Yeah.
We can definitely
Mr. Gaskin.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask a question, but I think it goes all the way back to perhaps the second, maybe the third frame there, when you mentioned where when the student takes the test, if they answer one question and answer it correctly, the next question would become harder. And then, of course, if they miss that question, they would go back and the question would be easier. Do you know whether that is aligned with the chronological age or the mental age?
That is.
I don't want to confuse you. I'm going back to my test and measurement days.
That is a question that I do not know the answer to, Mr. Worthy. I would have to look into that for you.
I was just curious because of what you said there. Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, and really the point that I want to make around MAP is that the MAP assessment is a assessment that tests national standards, and it differs from the Milestones because the Milestone assesses Georgia standards that are taught that year. So I just want to provide some comfort to our community as well as our board. If you see a proficiency rate that is low, that does not mean that that would be the proficiency if the students took the Milestones. Now, we do use the MAP as a predictor of proficiency, but it is just a predictor.
Mr. Gaskins, did you say that I'm still trying to wrap my head around like the differences? So did you say with the MAP score that we're able to actually see progress, like, you know, like gradual progress?
Yes.
It's like whether they like met a particular score or not?
That's correct. The primary use of MAP is to show progress.
Okay.
It's not to show proficiency. It provides proficiency scores and it shows a predictor of proficiency, but we want teachers to be able to do both. We want students to be proficient on grade level standards, but we also know that our students sometimes come to us 2 grade levels below or 2 grade levels above. So we would expect them to have average growth in which MAP will tell us over the year. So if you are a 5th grader that comes in at a 6th grade level, it is not okay just to say this student's going to do fine on the Milestones, but also how did that student grow? How did we add value to that student? Because that student already came to us above level, and that's really how we use the MAP assessment.
I see. And what the numbers that you showed us right now are like current, like comparisons with the information.
Right. It is from our winter assessment. We usually take a little dip in what those scores look like in the winter. Of course, students were in school in January and in February and learned more content, but that was a snapshot of their performance when we gave it in early December.
So we don't have an accurate, unfortunately, picture of what was gained those first 2 months of the year. And then, of course, we've lost the last 2.5 months of the year.
But we do have like comparisons with over like this last year, like not right now, but from last school year to this school year, right? Because we've been given the MAP for, I think, 2 years now, right?
Yes, we have that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Gaskins, if I remember right, this, I mean, I think you've already said it. This is a nationwide test.
It is a assessment that assesses national standards, but it is given in multiple districts across the country.
Do we give it to all students, or is it? Do we give it to all students every year, or is it kind of a random sampling?
We give it to all kindergarten through 8th grade students. Now, so we use MAP, and MAP is a formative assessment. So it's probably more appropriate for me to talk about we give a formative assessment, we give a universal screener, because there are a lot of different universal screeners and formative assessments. So for example, at Alps and Gaines, we use a formative assessment called iReady. So that is a pilot that we're using. The difference between MAP and iReady is that students can interact with iReady all year. So it gives them a diagnostic assessment, and then it provides them supplemental lessons to improve their performance throughout the year, as opposed to MAP, where they take it just 3 times, 3 diagnostic assessments throughout the year. So I don't want to complicate it. I don't want us to think that MAP is what we give. We give a formative assessment. The vendor that we've decided to use is MAP. And in our other schools, we use iReady, because that could change. And I don't want a change to say we've given MAP and now we're giving something different. MAP is a formative assessment. So as long as we give a formative assessment, we can have comparable data.
Yeah.
How, I was trying to like take a look as you were going through, and also as it is like with the data that's listed, but what were some of the, like, for me, it felt very alarming. And I know like with the areas, you know, of course, there, you have the numbers that may be low, you know, so the N size is very, you know, quite different. But even with, you know, an appropriate N size, some of those numbers were alarming. I couldn't catch Mr. Gaskins with the MAP testing or the formative assessment from how much growth or improvement has been noted among our students over this past, like with those data points. So between last year and then this year, I was trying to catch it while it was up. And I know previously we had been given this information, not all of it, but more so in a report, like with attendance and referrals and things like that, but it is helpful to see it here. What have you noticed is improvement?
So what
both, like formative as well as because it looks like I saw some, although the numbers were very low, it still seems like I saw some improvement with our end of course as well.
So I'll first talk about just MAP for a second. So we do see improvement and progress as it relates to MAP. The problem is that if our students come in 2 or more grade levels below, that means that they have to grow faster. Mm-hmm. So if you are an on grade level student, you need to make a year worth of growth, and that's appropriate. If you are a student that has come in 2 years below, you need to make a year and a half or 2 years of growth in 1 year. So when you really drill down and look at progress data, our teachers are really helping our students make progress, but it may not be enough progress to have them on level. Yeah. And so that is the data that you're seeing with proficiency. So kids are growing, they just have a lot of growing to do, and it takes more consistency. So students that are behind, they have to have a really good teacher every single solitary year, so eventually they can catch up. The other thing about our EOC data, there is some improvement, probably not enough improvement that we would need. I think that comes to really working with our high schools around what, and we've talked about this a lot, about what a retaking of a class looks like. So, you know, we hope and we think that with a move to block scheduling, that a student can take a face-to-face teacher when they retake a course and have multiple opportunities to have a face-to-face teacher, versus a lot of times when students retake a class and we're trying to get them on track for graduation, they take that through Edgenuity, formerly known as E2020. Mm-hmm. So we would hope that a live teacher, which I have a lot of confidence in, would help improve those scores compared to a student that is retaking a course and that may have taken that course through a computer.
That's the best thing I've heard yet. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Gaskin. Mr.
Yes,
Gaskin. Yeah, I thoroughly agree with what you said a few minutes ago in terms of student to teacher, and then of course with them improving as they go along, because on that 4x4 schedule, they're with the teacher longer. They're taking 4 classes per term, but they're in there for 90 minutes. And that should, as I recall, when we implemented the 4x4 block schedule, we saw progress with students in terms of catching up, because when a student is behind and they go on a 6-period traditional schedule, and whatever schedule we running now, I don't know what you call it, chances are some of them not going to ever catch up. So I really believe implementing the 4x4 block schedule again is going to be helpful.
And in full transparency, Mr. Worthy, I completely agree with you. And that's why I have supported our high school principals in that change. Block scheduling is not without its faults as well. And though we actually think that the benefits outweigh the faults that block scheduling has. So we're gonna continue to work through those, but we really think as it relates to students that need to take a course over, that a block schedule gives them a better opportunity than our current schedule.
And also looking at the research, and I'm quite sure you all have done a good job on that. The 90 minutes, you know, that's a long time with teachers, but I think it's beneficial. I know I did it at Cedar. I implemented the 30-30-30 plan, especially for some teachers like math teachers at the time. You know, we were using overhead projectors. You know, you stand before them 90 minutes working a problem on an overhead projector, or even on the chalkboard or the dry erase board. You're going to lose some of them. Some of them are going to go to sleep. But like I said, pacing guides, and as I said, I implemented the 30-30-30 plan, you know, so just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gaskins. And, you know, something you said and some of the board members said were a perfect segue into the last comment I had about our data. And that's just that we already had significant gaps. As Dr. Gant said, it's alarming. And, you know, that data was essentially through December. So it doesn't show what that improvement has been. And we want to believe that there has been growth, but the gaps are alarming. And now that we have essentially lost 2.5 months of school, couple that with the summer loss that naturally occurs for many of our kids, we're going to be in a very challenging place come August, when hopefully we're able to return to school. So Mr. Gaskins and his team are really working to ensure. So when we talk about having to grow 1.5 years or 2 years in a year, when we think about, because there's significant value to a live teacher, like he said, and we, like everyone across the country, have done the best that we can with digital and distant learning, but it can't replace, for a 5-year-old who's learning to read, having that face-to-face teacher. So we recognize that we have huge work ahead of us to try to catch these kids up, just even from what they've missed in being with us, not to even mention those other gaps that were already there. So we're going to have to be creative in what that work looks like next school year. But his team is excited about the challenge. Yes, go ahead.
This is Linda. I was just going to say, I'm very happy to hear that we're going to be looking at some innovative ways to address this. I think I spend most of my waking hours reading on what everybody else is doing across the nation. So I'm hoping that, you know, we will take this opportunity to see what needs to be different about how we approach learning for our kids. And so I'm truly excited about our potential to have innovation kind of in terms of just not going back doing the same thing. I think I heard one governor say, if we go back to where we were when we started this pandemic, then that's just the baseline. You want to start there, but we want to pivot from that into things that actually bring the focus in on the things that we need to do differently. Right. So I'm all supportive of that, and I'll have to spend some time with the data. I'm kind of right now in a little bit of shock, but I'll get over it. I'll get there.
Yeah, I think we're all there. And I just keep going back to that was December. I want to believe that there was growth from January and in January and February. However, again, we lost March, April, and May, and we ignore the impact that has had on our kids, and recognizing that for many of our children, this time at home has not been filled with instructional activities that even may supplement or complement the instruction that was being sent home. So we're going to have to address that reality so that we can continue in our work to close this gap and bring all of our kids up to the performance level that we know they're capable of reaching, but they need to have that academic teaching and support and scaffolding to get them there. So
I don't want this to also be discouraging for our teachers, and so I'd be curious to know, what kind of responses are you getting from them in terms of their work effort and seeing the rewards of that work. I would love to, and I'll go back to our strategic plan. I think there are probably some indicators there that would point us in some direction, give us some direction on that. But yeah, I think we've got some really, I've seen on some of the Facebook posts that people have shared with me how innovative teachers have been in reaching our kids and trying to get the work done in spite of what's going on now. And so, yeah, I would love to see more of that inspirational kind of stuff that kind of helps us keep our heads as we look through the real impacts of what's going on right now and what it's going to look like for us at the end of the school year.
yes.
If I could build on that and what Linda just said, I did, Dr. Thomas, I did kind of forward you a question about, on the state level, if there's been any leadership on this, but it seems to me that from now on, we may be in a situation where the distinction between classroom and classroom learning and home life or home learning will be more blurred than it has been in the past. And I would love to see a platform which is, and I don't know if Linda has come across such platforms in her readings, but a platform that could easily transition from the classroom to home, not to subtract from the effectiveness of face-to-face in the flesh situation, learning such environment, but that can be a much more friendlier and platform in which students can transition, can maybe perhaps begin a lesson in the classroom and then continue on if they're so inclined, or if they need extra assistance, to continue a discussion maybe for a half hour after school in their home, or that type of thing. I mean, I find myself on this platform the first time, second time, third time, fourth time, fifth time that we've done the Zooming, it to me felt very foreign and very awkward. But the more I do it, the more, provided we have good sound and good visual, and there's a good effective platform for folks to go in and go out of this type of tele-educational platform, it could potentially, we could be what we're talking about in terms of being stronger, having been through this pandemic, coming out of it, and to have another area in which we can teach students. So I just throw that out there for whatever comments you have or whatever you've heard on the state level, or whatever Linda's read, or any discussion.
We've actually already started that work, and we will next week be having conversation with you all about the budget, but tomorrow our cabinet is meeting to talk about the CARES Act funds that we will receive. And Mr. Gaskins and his team have already worked diligently. They started this over probably a month ago, looking for a online learning system. So not just a management platform like we have already, but something that will actually support online instruction that can take place in class, but then transition to home in our efforts to prepare for what we've heard may be other spikes and times that we'll be home, but also can support home learning in other settings as necessary. So we have already worked, and I think he has identified a very competitive product. And our plan is to utilize a portion of our CARES funding to do that, to support students. We're also working with some people from the University of Georgia, Wellbeing Project, and groups like that to identify where our internet gaps might be. So and ensure that our students have the digital access when they are home to use those programs once purchased. So yes, sir, we are actively working on solutions to address that issue.
Dr. Thomas,
Yes, sir.
Dr. Thomas, I
Yes.
just want to thank and congratulate Mr. Gaskin for his hard work and also the presentation that he presents to the Board of Education. It's helpful to me, hopefully to the other board members. But thank you, Mr. Gaskin.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.
All right, if we don't have any other questions on that, I'll just really quickly, again, we will be presenting budget next week. Just another round, as I'm sure all of you have heard, there's the discussion around the 14% cut for us, over $16 million. So we are spending a lot of stressful time together as a team, seeing what we can do to be prepared for any potential budget crises, for lack of a better word, that may be impending. So we are working on that, and Mr. Griner will be prepared to share updated recommendations with you all next week. And the only other items we have will come up through consent agenda. And if you have questions for our team as we get to those items, everyone will be prepared to address them.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. And Mr. Gaskin and Mr. Barlament. Sounds like it's been a lot of hours and brain power and energy put into really getting the data together, as well as thinking through what our students and teachers need. We will move forward, Dr. Thomas, if that's all for on your report. We'll move forward with our policy to be posted for public comments. That's item 6. And so I am going to turn the floor over to Dr. Yeager, as well as Dr. Myers, to start with that policy 6.1 and 6.2, and you all can just sort of walk us through those policies.
Thank you, Dr. Gant. So policy JQKA we spoke about last month. It's a revision of a policy. We discussed changing the words from foreign to some other word, and there was some confusion about what the point of the policy was. So Dawn, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have simplified this policy to its core, which is that we enroll students residing in Athens, Clarke County without regard to citizenship or immigration status, according to the Flower v. Doe ruling in 1982. So it's a lot simpler than it was before, I believe. Did you want to say anything else, Dawn?
No, that's exactly right, Dr. Yeager. Simple, concise, and we follow the federal law.
So we would like to move this up to be posted for public comment for 4 weeks. Do I have a motion? Or are there any questions?
Yeah, next week.
I guess
Did you
we
get the
did.
motion?
I'm sorry, I'm new at this. I'm still trying to figure out how to be. So
I got to listen to your committee meeting. That was a great meeting. So yes, I'll definitely move to support that.
I second.
okay.
Do we do that this week or do we do it next?
Just to move it forward.
No, we're just
Nope.
discussing.
No,
And then
Okay.
there you go.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll
We
figure
did
it out.
that next week.
Yeah, we
Okay.
don't have to vote on it.
We didn't vote.
But Dr. Yeager, I did want to mention, and you may have already shared this with the board, but you and Mr. Davis, if you could just update the board on the changes with you sort of taking that seat,
Yeah, so
replacing.
I'm because of commitments and personal commitments to family and such, I'm stepping forward from the vice chair of the policy committee to operate as the chair, at least for now, with Mr. Davis's permission. Did you
Yeah,
want to comment, Greg?
I'm just at a point right now where I don't think I'm giving it its full attention. And so I really appreciate Dr. Yeager being willing to step forward.
Yes,
My
thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you. Just wanted to notify the full board. You can continue, Dr. Yeager.
Okay, so 6.2, which is the foreign student regulation. Again, we talked about this a little bit last time. I think the policy committee determined that this regulation was entirely unnecessary, and so we are moving to rescind it completely.
Good.
Dawn, did you want to comment on that any further?
No, that's exactly right. It's outdated. The language is confusing, and any references in the regulation really are already covered in this policy, JQKA, and others. For example, one good example is, for some reason, we felt at some point in our history to clarify how foreign students would transfer credit into the district, and there's a really easy answer to that. They transfer any credits they've earned in the same way a student who's coming from Tennessee would transfer credit in. Our counselors evaluate their transcripts and we place them appropriately. So there's just no need. It's a confusing regulation that's not necessary, and in the interest and aligned with actually some policy recommendations for shoring up our policy manual, it seems best practice to simply rescind it.
Yeah, and there's also text about tuition and admissions and all kinds of strange language that is not applicable anymore. So it's not useful. Okay, 6.3, unless there's any questions, moving on. JQK is also a simplification and clarification of how students that are considered exchange students, and we've clarified some of the language, that it's a high school only program called Exchange Visitor Program. So that wording has gone into the policy to clarify that we welcome and accept all students in this program. Any comments or questions about this one? My only comment is I want to put students in front of Exchange Visitor Program, but I don't think it matters too much. I wanted to say students from the Exchange Visitor Program, but that would be a very friendly amendment. I don't know why the English bothers me there, but it's probably fine. So that one would be moved up for public comment as well. Any comments or questions? I can't see you all because of all the different things on my screen. So if anybody has any comments, there's one new message. Hang on, let me see. Oh, that's not regarding this topic. Okay, moving ahead, unless I see any comments. Emergency closing. So 6.4, emergency closings. This one is actually no changes. It's just it being reviewed. It's the regulation, which is 6.5 that's being reviewed. So there are no changes to AFC. AFC R1 has some changes which we discussed quite a bit in the policy meeting. Am I talking too fast? So there, we went in, as we say, to drain the swamp, and we ended up full of alligators. We went in to change a few words and decided to change a lot of words, partially because of the conditions that we're in right now. So this policy was originally written for emergency weather conditions, and we realized that it was relevant to public safety and health conditions. So we've added those words, public safety, to the policy. It now reads emergency conditions under emergency conditions, and then it gives examples: inclement weather, public safety, etc. And then it talks about how the superintendent is in charge of deciding to close the schools. And there was some discussion about 12-month personnel versus all staff. And so we've made that simpler by just saying all staff are required to be present unless the superintendent or the representative says otherwise. So again, we've tried to make it simpler. It then goes on to talk about what to do if the employee can't make it to work. So hopefully it's more clear and simpler, and it encompasses more conditions. Are there any questions?
I thought that was beautifully done.
I had a question about the part where it says, if an employee is unable to comply with this requirement, so that section, the absence will be treated as a personal leave day or vacation day, or maybe made up on a future non-work day. And so I guess my concern was something like in the situation that we're in right now, or in a situation where somebody who maybe lived farther out or in an area where like maybe they weren't able to get in, whether there needs to be something for that, or in the situation that we're in right now, if it's that, hey, everybody needs to come in, but the students aren't going to be here, if there are people who are in vulnerable populations, or I don't know. I think we need to have some way to address that so that those people are not having to take personal days.
I agree with you, Carol, because when you look at employees of a school district, they give an example. Some have different contracts. I'll begin with this, and Dr. Thomas would be Prime Minister Gaskin, to all of the central office people. They are 248-day contract people. And normally when you have inclement weather, I know in the past, superintendent would say, you report to work if you can. Now, with the teachers, they have 190 days on their contracts. And then, of course, normally when you have inclement weather like that, you don't require them to come in. Now, the high school principals, they have a 248-day contract. And those contracts are referred to as 12-month contracts. They work during the summer too. And of course, with the elementary principals and also the middle school principals, it's 200 and some days. I'm not sure exactly how many days the elementary principals are working, and also the middle school principals. But you're right, Kara. I think we need some clarity on that. We need to wordsmith that some more so that it can be clear in terms of what would happen if you have inclement weather.
So I would direct this to Lynn. I think we didn't touch that section other than to remove the first sentence. So we didn't talk about the possibility of having vulnerable employees or employees that couldn't come in at all. So Lynn, do you have a policy for that?
So federal law right now has dictated some guidance on what to do when people are in vulnerable groups during this pandemic. We also have, that has been our practice, and that's what we've done. We have had employees that were unable to come in, maybe because of a childcare issue or something like that. And we have, if they've been asked to come in, they have had to take leave because it just isn't fair for everyone that doesn't have children to work for everybody. You know what I mean? So we have to be as fair as we can while being compassionate.
Sure.
And we can work with that employee to say, okay, well, maybe they can get childcare on this day and not that day. Our supervisors have been very lenient and done that as well. So I think we're taking really good care of our employees during this time.
But would that be addressed in a compensation policy or something that would be internal to HR? I don't know. I'm asking. are these negotiated rights in terms of who gets paid? And
Well, you know, we decided at the beginning of this pandemic that we had budgeted salary for our employees and we would continue to pay them.
right.
So I guess I'm not really understanding where we're with what we need to include that we haven't already taken care of. Because we don't want to restate federal policy and federal guidelines in all of our board policies. You know, that's just.
And all I'm saying is that if there was a need for that or that to be stated in policy, I would think it would be under compensation as opposed to this one that's mostly dealing with the conditions of coming to work.
So it's, yeah, I think that's possible, Linda, and I'm not familiar enough with that to be able to answer that today. We'll look into that for sure. I think in terms of what Lynn just said, my read of the sentence that starts with all staff will be required to be present, unless the superintendent says otherwise. And so in this case, we're applying federal policy where we're saying that the employees are being paid for that day, even though it's been canceled. Is that an appropriate read, Dr. Thomas or Lynn?
Yes, ma'am.
So, and that's the federal guidelines. Yeah.
Yes.
And again, for people that are budgeted in the salary and the day is canceled for various reasons, they can authorize them to be paid. Okay, so that's, I will look though, Linda, that's a good point. I'll look into, or maybe Lynn can help me look into the idea that there's some compensation language somewhere.
Can I just offer a suggestion? And I'm just thinking what Kara said. You know, I think when you start talking about direct supervisor, you would certainly, I can understand exactly what Lynn's saying in terms of people feeling like they're being perhaps singled out or exceptions made that are not fair. I'm just wondering if there should be some caveat in there about on the district level, if the superintendent, you know, sees that certain category of employee may be exempted in another way in terms of coming to work during a pandemic or some other emergency. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just kind of raising that as a question or food for thought.
I don't have the policy in front of me, but I think the language that we chose said that if the superintendent or their designee requires you to come to work, then you come to work. So at that point, superintendent, if we wanted to go over and above, thank you, Lisa, if we wanted to go over and above what the federal mandate was allowing us to do, we could certainly do that, which we can do. To be honest, you know, we extend things. We extend FMLA to employees that are not covered under federal law. So we do that often.
Yeah, so in this case, if the superintendent decided a certain category of workers was exempt, she would announce it, and it would not require your immediate supervisor to be notified.
Right. Okay. And just so y'all are aware, I don't think an immediate supervisor in the district has made a call on an employee coming without calling us to make sure that they were correct. It's just such uncharted waters that everybody is moving with trepidation just to make sure that they're doing everything correctly.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, Lynn. I was thinking in terms of something that Dr. Thomas addressed a few weeks ago in a kind of a public statement about employees who, you know, we needed help in terms of food distribution for students. And certainly, I think, you know, Dr. Thomas made it very clear that, you know, that while each school staff were going to be responsible for certain days, certain locations and everything, that she was very sensitive about, you know, the individual situations of folks, and that there was a means by which, you know, some may be called upon more than others. Is that correct, Dr. Thomas?
That is correct. And it's been challenging, Mr. Davis, to find that balance because we've used the word volunteer. But then when we've said volunteer, some people have taken that to mean, oh, well, no, if I just want to drop in, I can. And so trying to find that appropriate language to suggest that if you are able, considering that we all are still being paid full-time salaries, if you don't have extenuating circumstances, we really need your help. But, if you are a high-risk category or you're caring for an elderly parent or you have a child that you have to care for that's high risk, any of those categories we were very sensitive to and did not expect them to be in. So you're exactly right.
And so, Lynn, based on what Dr. Thomas said, is that clear in this language? I mean, would that be something that would certainly be within the in the superintendent's discretion?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Okay, any other comments? Questions? Kara, if you had some ideas, feel free to send them.
No, I think that's fine. I think the what Greg just said about how that would be covered in that first part where it said that the superintendent, I don't know, I forget, I took it off my screen. But
Okay.
my concern about that part was that it said like it would have to be a public announcement. And I guess that could be a public announcement if it were like this category of people doesn't need to come. But I thought it might be weird to make a public announcement about, hey, Joe, you don't have to come to work. So anyway, I think it's fine.
Okay, well, we can finesse it a little bit. Maybe think about it. And is it possible to make a friendly amendment next week? When we
Sure.
vote on it? Okay, so think about it
Sure.
and we'll maybe make a minor tweak here and there next week when we vote. Okay, moving forward in the interest of time, policy GBM has some revisions that were aligning practice with policy. So there were some changes to how HR was working in terms of dates and deadlines about professional personnel transfer. And so this policy has been simplified and worded to now align with practice. Lynn, did you want to comment further?
It's just that this was a process that the principals developed with guidance from HR a few years ago. This is how they wanted internal transfers to work. And then it also, that June date aligns with what the PSC now allows teachers to get out of their contracts until June 15th. It used to be back in May. And so we just wanted to be consistent and allow our teachers to move internally. If they could move to another district, we wanted to allow them to move internally as well.
Okay. Any questions or comments? Again, this is in the category of being posted for public comment. So if there are teachers or personnel that are watching us and want to comment on these changes, please put your comments on the website. Okay, moving ahead, GBRH, professional personnel leaves and absences. Again, this is a very minor edit on the 4th page of the code to change a very specific number, 248, to simply 12-month. As Mr. Worthy noted, it's hard to remember when you're talking about 12-month employees, how many days they're assigned. So we're simplifying it to now just be 12-month employees.
Okay.
Did you have a comment, Mr.
Dr. Yeager,
Yes.
I had a, well, I guess a question, comment, whatever, with, and I guess this would be addressed to Lynn Duke. Some years ago, before I retired, we established a sick leave bank. And as I navigated through this policy, I didn't see it, or maybe I overlooked it. Do we still have a sick leave bank?
No, sir.
No.
We did away with that a few years ago. And I believe, Mike Pruitt, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that we did that because there was some litigation around sick leave banks with some discriminatory practices, not us, but Am I right, Mike, that they kind of came under fire because it was up to people to decide who got the sick leave from another employee? Am I right, Mike?
Yeah, it can get very subjective and give rise to discrimination claims. And it also has to be handled really carefully to avoid double taxation of the leave as income to both the donor and the donee. So for lots of reasons, it's just a problematic thing.
That left since I've been on the board, so I remember that meeting.
That's too bad. It's so complicated. Those are helpful to employees sometimes.
One other comment, Ms. Lynn Duke, and I happen to see the vacation leave granted to 12-month contract and taken out the 248-day employees. Now, would this policy be consistent with employment contracts? Because normally when, well, I know in the past, when employment contracts were issued, they had 248 days on that contract. You're planning to have that consistent with this policy and put 12 months on that employment contract?
Mr. Pruitt, I don't know if we have to spell out the exact number of days on the contract itself. I'm guessing we do, because there's, you know, to say that somebody works 10 months, it could be, you know, 179, 190, you know, and it's still all 10 months. So I'm imagining we would have to still spell out the number of days on the contract, just thinking out loud.
Yeah, well, the contract form you use is phrased in terms of days, and every form I've ever seen is, so.
Okay, did that answer your question, Mr. Worthy?
Close enough. Thank you.
All right. Any other comments on these policies?
I have one, Tish. I just wanted to point out to the rest of the board members, I know there were, I think at least 5 of us at the policy meeting. What we're attempting to do as a policy committee is to address one of the concerns of Cognia about some of our policies not being updated and promptly as they probably should have been, even though, as Don has pointed out, we have policies that are based on federal law, and federal law has not changed in decades. But you could see from someone looking from the outside in that it seemed like we were either not going by those policies anymore, or ignoring those policies, or certainly not giving them any attention. And so what we're hoping as a policy committee is at the next policy committee meeting, go through starting with the G policies, the personnel policies, and not to try to rush comment or rush individual board members' concerns, but to really hone in on those groups of policies and move at a good clip, because we've tended to bog down on maybe 1 or 2 policies, and they get all the attention, and then the rest of them kind of go by the wayside. So you know, this is something that John Knox had started earlier last year, and we kind of went by the wayside. So John, we're going to pick it back up again and move quickly, hopefully.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear, because it was frustrating to me that for the second half of 2019, things got in the way. We'll just put it that way. And so the policy committee meetings were not productive. And so I'm glad to hear that we're back on track now.
Good.
Hey, Dr. Yeager, one of the things or a couple of things that stood out to me, but it's not for me, it's more for future consideration, I think, as we have time to, if this policy comes back around. Well, a few things actually. One, that at the top where it defines like who is an immediate family, I do like the fact that it actually includes any relative living in the immediate household of the employee. I think because families look so different, I think that's something that's critical. So I'm happy to see that. A couple of things I wanted to just note, maybe for future consideration, again, not to pull it or what have you, is inside of, I think it was 4. Let's see. Yeah. Under 4, where it says like if the employee is absent from work for more than 2 consecutive days or more than 7, that they may be required to submit medical documentation. And I feel like it's one other area. Oh yeah, and 6, where it says employees requesting to use sick leave on the day before or after a holiday may be required to provide medical documentation. One of the things I think as a policy committee, but just for us as a whole to keep in mind, when it says maybe, I think that adds a level of discretion, which I think is good until the discretion, until you run into someone who might not necessarily ethically use power. Yeah. And then how do we determine like when a person, and all of this actually may be determined by federal law, I don't know, but it's like, how do we determine, how does the supervisor determine when they will require medical documentation? And then are we putting like maybe vulnerable or marginalized populations at further risk because not everyone goes to the doctor when they are sick? I do understand the spirit of it though, being that we don't want a high percentage of absences, particularly right before and after holidays, which a person might be tempted to do. But those were just some things that came to mind as I was reading back through this. I knew it was something, but I couldn't think of it during policy. But just some things for us to keep in mind as a policy committee or what have you.
If I respond, Dr. Grant? So I am very cautious with supervisors on this one because of what you said. When we have discretion, sometimes people don't do what we want them to do. I talked to them about being very consistent. So if you ask one employee that has been out, it's generally, it says may because we only want it to be applied to people that are, I call it earning and burning them. They're going through their sick days. They're calling out sick because they don't want to come to work and not because they're sick. And so that means that you have to be really careful that you're being consistent and that they're not just arbitrarily picking on people that they don't like. But it says may because we don't want to ask someone to bring in a doctor's note that perhaps is going through chemo and they're coming, they're in and out sick and they're sick. You don't have to ask for them to give a doctor's note. So I tell them that they have to be very consistent, and I have ever checked them on it. I can, if they ask for a note because I'll get a call 9 times out of 10, he asked me for a note, but he didn't ask so-and-so for a note, and I'll go and pull other people that have like attendance and ask. And so we monitor that and we try to make sure that people are being consistent because to be honest, when you get to the point where you're asking for doctor's notes, you're moving toward termination because you believe there's an attendance issue. And that's, so we have to be really careful and sure that we're doing the right thing when we do that.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Do we want to move forward? Dr. Gant, shall we move to 7?
Yep, we can move to get my screen back here. We can move to item 7, and these are the policies to be adopted or rescinded. Dr. Yeager.
Thank you. And I would just check with Dawn, were there any public comments on these? Because they have been up for public comment, correct?
They have been up. it'll be a month next week. And historically, no, we have not, it's kind of historic, but we have not received any public comment on the code or the policy that accompanies the code.
Okay. So just a refresher, 7.1 is the revision to JCDA. And this was just a removal of the requirement or rewording of the requirement that we no longer want to require a piece of paper that the parent has seen the code. We're trying to simplify the lives of the teachers having to do all this paperwork, and have changed the wording to just be, shall be required to acknowledge receipt of the code at some point. And then, of course, pointing out that failure to acknowledge the receipt of the code does not prevent the application of the code to the student. We talked about this before, I think, and there's no comment, so we will move to adopt. Are there any other comments about this one?
Couple of just a follow-up questions. I know this was, I don't think it was there during our policy meeting, but maybe it's, I think you referenced it, Dr. Myers. Dr. Welsh's.
That's in the next one.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That would be 7.2, I believe, which is the Student Code of Conduct revision. And in this case, you're exactly right. Dawn has provided us very kindly with a letter from Professor Welch, who explains the changes that have been made to the Code of Conduct. I found this letter very helpful.
Good. Good. Yeah, if I can, Dr. Yeager, just a preview next month in June, we hope that Dr. Welsh will be able to join us at the June work session to deliver a really more thorough, comprehensive report highlighting his research findings overall around student discipline. But he prepared this memo for your consideration as we look at adopting the revised Code of Conduct next week. And the memo, as you pointed out, Dr. Yeager, and thank you for that compliment to Dr. Welsh, I appreciate him as well. It demonstrates the connection between research and policy and shows how we've been utilizing Dr. Welsh's expertise and his initial findings in his study in crafting the code revision. But I think he's also very wise to point out that we haven't been able to do all of the changes.
Right.
Not all practicable. Some of them are very expensive. Some of them require further policy action. And so he did, I think, really provide, I hope, some reassurance to board members and to the public that we are making intentional changes to our discipline policies in a measured way as we can, based on best practice and based on research. And so he does say that we've been able to incorporate his second and third suggested revisions into his current code, and we're excited about that work. It kind of fortuitous and maybe funny at the same time. The administrators were meeting and made some recommendations at the very same time Dr. Welsh was reviewing our code and laying it against his research. And those two groups came up with some of the same recommendations. And one of those was to embed the matrix into the code, and you'll see that. And for many reasons, it gives administrators many different variations of discipline actions by tying a specific matrix to the specific behaviors. And so again, Dr. Welsh and our team of administrators and school professionals both came up with that very same solution, independent of each other. And that tells me that it's probably a pretty good idea. And so we're happy with that revision. It provides, you can see in Dr. Welsh's memo, he references the framework for the strategic approach, includes policy, program, and personnel actions. And so these are examples of our policy revisions. So again, incorporating the matrix for a more, a wider range of disciplinary consequences, and then also to improve the tier of behavior support. And that kind of goes along with the matrix. We're more explicitly saying restorative practices can be embedded at tier 1. We don't have to wait till tier 3. We're taking out in the code that pyramid that really led people to believe that you have to do everything at the bottom of the pyramid before you move to the second step, before you move to the third. And some of our best behavioral interventions were at the top, and we want to move those down. We want to do them earlier and sooner. And so it gives some flexibility to administrators to understand how to do that work.
Thank you, Dawn. That helps a lot.
Good.
Any other thoughts or comments about this memo? I'm glad he's coming to talk to us in June. That'll be interesting.
So is that memo a part of our, is it in board docs? Because I don't remember seeing it.
It's right next to the
Oh, it's
code.
next to the code of conduct. Okay, I missed that. All right, sorry.
So
Curious, Dr. Yeager, Dr. Myers, it is very, very exciting to like have, you know, the research alongside policy and then with our code of conduct. I know with his memo, and it was stated that I think revisions 2 and 1 were a bit more like easily incorporated.
Yeah.
I think. But 1 actually takes some pretty bold, there's some pretty bold claims there, and I think really deal with the philosophy of student behavior and what we believe about suspensions and things like that. And in the earlier part of his letter, he mentioned like needing like 1 and 4, forget the language that was used, about 1 and 4 not being, oh yeah, they require further policy action and resources. It also seems like it requires a bit of a philosophical shift when a district says we're no longer going to suspend people between the ages, you know, or pre-K through 2nd grade or what have you. And so I'm very curious to know, like, I guess, you know, Dr. Myers or Dr. Thomas, is this the way that we're going? And is this, I don't want to like ask, you know, you to say, oh, commit to this now, but clearly, as he stated earlier, we have a crisis as it relates to discipline and discipline disparities. And so I am curious regarding the general direction of discipline and philosophies around suspensions and things like that.
Yes, Dr. Gant, you're exactly right. And so while I don't have a crystal ball and I can't tell you exactly where we'll end up on this discussion, because it does involve a lot of stakeholders aligning those beliefs and changing practices if we're going to do something as brave and bold as reduce suspensions as it suggests, I would invite the board to begin thinking about really our time and space. I've been giving this a lot of thought, where we are with the school closure for 3 months and how that might factor in. You know, people are writing and speculating about how so many things about education are going to forever be changed. And I've been reflecting about what pieces of student discipline might change. And so, for example, I wonder if administrators might be more reluctant to send a child home on a suspension when we've already missed 3 months at the end of this year and that type of thing. So I wonder if there won't be some opportunities in our space and time and where we are to make some of the radical shifts that Dr. Welsh is recommending that would have been best practice, of course, ahead of a pandemic, but it might bring some of those things to light. It's very interesting time to think about student discipline as we return. There's also some speculation about student discipline might be more important than ever because concerns. And so if we're social distancing and we're having very high standards for student behavior to not endanger the health of other people, what does that mean for student discipline? And what does that mean for our options of keeping students in school who may not easily follow the rules that are set, that not only have, as in the past, implications for disrupting student learning, but they may now have implications for endangering other people's health. It's a very, very interesting time to think about all of those factors in student discipline. And I'm really excited about the district utilizing Dr. Welsh's research to tee up those conversations. Dr. Thomas, is there anything else that you have to add?
No, ma'am, I'm in agreement completely. And I do think it does involve a shift in mindset. It involves consistent professional learning, you know, for administrators, but particularly for teachers. And when we talk about cultural understanding and culturally relating to students, and you know, how we interpret behaviors, and not just how we interpret those behaviors, but how we then react to behaviors. And do we de-escalate, or do we cause behaviors to escalate? And so, you know, much bigger than a code of conduct, it really is about our conduct, right? And so how do we conduct ourselves as professionals, and what behaviors do we engage in to help support students and create a learning environment? You know, we know all children aren't going to come to school 100% of the time and follow 100% of the rules, but how do we respond when they don't? And what kind of culture do we establish as a school setting? What expectations do we establish as a school setting? So really having that professional learning. So we're teaching kids, we have to teach them how to behave in certain settings, but we also have to teach ourselves how to respond when that behavior is not conducive to what we need to support learning in the classroom.
If I could add something, there was a discussion that we had. This is back when we were in the Mitchell Bridge building. I remember that's when we used to have board meetings in the gym, and we had a presentation by our head of technology at the time, and I'm sorry I forgot his name, but he was, I think we did away with that position under Dr. Lanou. In fact, I know we did. But he was talking about, in a way, he may have been before his time, but he was talking about, you know, if a student were absent from the classroom setting, that the technology was there to include that student. And I'm raising that in the context of discipline, because we may need to start thinking about how do we, you know, maintain classroom discipline, which is what we're all, you know, and classroom order, but at the same time, teach all students. And so if we start looking at this platform of tele-platform as another way of teaching, again, not the preferable way, but as a viable way, then that would be another reason to really think hard and invest, not only in the sense of, well, if we have another pandemic next year or whatever, but even in terms of just changing the way that we teach students and teach all students, even students that are having difficulty at a particular point in time adjusting to a classroom setting. So, you know, we would need folks who could actually go to the home perhaps and set that up. I don't know, but I think it's something that we need to think about. And I know many of y'all are already thinking about it.
Thank you for adding that. Other things under this, Dr. Yeager, or board members, or anyone, as far as our code of conduct?
I don't have anything further. Unless we get more public comments between now and next week.
And board members, if we do, I'll share that with you immediately. I'll not wait until next week. You'll receive an email from me if there's any public comments, so you can take that under consideration and review well ahead of next week's meeting. Okay.
Great, thank you.
And I did want to just thank Dr. Meyer. She's done an excellent job, she and Ms. Tillman, of pulling all of those policies and organizing them for us by initial date. And so that we will be able to go through and start revising many of these policies that we were talking about today. So that has been combined with the other document that you referenced, Dr. Gant, that should really help us vet the policies that we have and look at the age of those policies and make any necessary updates. So thank you, Dr. Myers and Ms. Tillman, for that work.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking when I was looking at the document again that you shared, Dr. Myers, is like, oh my goodness, I know you could tell that you and Ms. Tillman had put it, that's a lot of organizing and a lot of reading and transferring. It was a lot. So thank you. All right, well, we will move forward, Dr. Yeager. If that is all, Dr. Thomas will sort of turn the floor back over to you with the personnel recommendations under.
Yes, so you have those attached and we will have those for vote next week. If you have any questions or concerns about any of the recommendations or on either of those lists, if you can just reach out to me and let me know, and otherwise we will move forward with voting on those next week.
We'll move forward with our items on our consent agenda to decide if we want to keep them or if there are any questions that we may have for you, or Dr. Thomas, any additional things that you feel you need to add.
Yes, ma'am.
Item 9.1, our work session minutes.
Consent.
Hear anyone saying pull it off. I heard Dr. Yeager consent. Okay. Oh, I just saw like a thumb go up in your screen, Mr. Davis. How did you do? That's pretty neat. Okay. Item 9.2.
Okay. I'm sorry, I need to defer to John.
Dr. Knox, are we clear?
Already went through it. Lisa has been vetting some things with me early, so yeah, don't worry about it. It's good.
Okay. Consent.
Been professionally edited.
Oh, that's so much. Oops. All right.
Oh, it was big. Thank you, Lisa. What did you do?
Okay. Our action, let's see, item 9.3, the action to approve the call board minutes. Does that stay on consent?
Consent.
Yeah.
All right. The action, item 9.4, to approve the intent to apply for Head Start funds, or I'm sorry, grant application.
Okay, this is the one that I didn't see earlier. Is it there now? I see the summary of it. Yeah. Okay.
I don't think there was a proposal, was there? It was just the.
I think this is just us saying that they can apply for it. I don't think this doesn't have the actual proposal there yet, right?
Right.
So the proposal will include or concludes the approach, the budget, the community assessment, the self-assessment, the programmatic long-term goals, the school readiness, the training and technical assistance, and those will be attached in the administrative section. They will not be open for public view.
Okay, that's good to know. Also, I wanted to know, Karen, when you do this, or just in general, have you had any guidance from Bright from the Start or any of the other accrediting agencies about space or creating space distinctions? Are we still allowed to have the teacher pupil ratio that we've had before? Anything new on that?
Okay, this is actually our annual grant application. The portion that the second intent for apply is actually for the supplemental funds in response to the coronavirus.
Right. And so I'm just asking if you've already received any directives from.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And to follow CDC and local health guidance.
Right.
And we've been participating in webinars and updates to ensure that we're in compliance with childcare regulations, but also that we're in compliance with CDC recommendations, Department of Health recommendations.
So I'm really wanting to know,
keeping our
are we
folks
at
safe.
risk of losing seats because of that compliance?
Not at this time, no. Our
Okay.
guidance, and it was part of that, the previous report is really around ensuring that we continue to serve our families through distance learning.
Right.
To ensure that they're still continuing to get parent-child together activities, and that they're continuing to have contact and wraparound services from a distance. Our hope, of course, is to return to face-to-face services.
Mhm.
And part of that second grant is looking at how we can safely reenter and ensure we have PPE. We're able to keep.
So you haven't lost any staff or anything yet?
No, ma'am. Our grant has continued to support our staff.
Okay.
Through.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes, and they have, in fact, each of our grants has specifically stated that they will continue to pay through the end of the grant year, and for us to continue to serve as best we can from a distance.
That's encouraging. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other questions about that item?
Consent.
Okay. All right. Item 9.5. Any questions about it? We want to leave it on consent?
Consent.
Okay.
Oh, one more. I'm sorry. I do have one quick question. Dr. Thomas is going to have to sign off on this grant, right? On this application.
Yes, ma'am. And,
okay.
And as does our board president.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, item 9.6.
I read that. I'm so glad Brandon is there. It was an interesting reading. That was really amazing. Okay.
Eureka.
Yes, consent.
Yeah, that one looks good.
On 8.
And 9.7, I say consent as well.
John has his hand up.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
You're still mute, John.
I knew it happened once. For both 9.7 and 9.8, I had a question. And the question was just simply, I didn't see dollar values on the purchases, whereas there was a dollar value for 9.6, I think. And so I was just interested in, if we're purchasing something, what's the cost?
I'm sorry, I thought we included that. So I can go back and revise that. Off memory, I think that the items for 6-8 and for our high school is not to exceed $300,000 for both of those.
It is.
John,
It
does
is
say
up there.
250,000 for
Okay, where was it?
9-8. It's up in the upper part, agenda item details, dollar amount. 9.7, it says 300,000, and 9.8, it says 250,000.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's kind of in the heading, not in the
Yeah. So can you
where
tell
the rest of the
a bit
information is.
about these two products and why we're buying them now and discussing?
Yep. So we are doing a math adoption for K through 8 and for 9th and 10th grade math. We have not done a math adoption in some time. Although we have purchased math materials, we have not, as a district, made an official adoption. An adoption cycle is about 3 years. So based on feedback from schools, we wanted to ensure that all teachers were using the same resources that were aligned to state standards, and that we identify those resources early enough in the year so we can provide appropriate training for our teachers. So we had an adoption resource committee that included teachers, instructional coaches, assistant principals. We worked with Veronica Jackson in our contracting department to put out RFPs. So those individuals in a virtual environment were able to review those materials. They selected 2 top materials that went out for public feedback. So we had a website, principals sent out emails to their teachers, to their parents, and to students at high school to give some feedback. And then based on that feedback, we selected these top resources for adoption.
Brandon, in light of the situation we're in now, and talking about teleplatforms and that type of thing, is this curriculum really very friendly for home use?
So we are, and I think Dr. Thomas alluded to this earlier, Mr. Davis, we are also going to look at our CARES money to recommend a supplemental resource for digital use. So these are for, the term we use is Tier 1 instruction, which is that on grade level instruction that is appropriate for whole group instruction that's provided by the teacher. So some of those, particularly the 6th through 8th grade and the K-5, they have a digital resource that is for student use. But I think it's just my recommendation that we have a supplemental resource that will be used for our digital resource. So they have them, but I would say that they will still need some support from the teacher with those resources. So we're looking at a supplemental resource that can be used without a lot of direction from the teacher.
Yeah, I do appreciate that. I'm just thinking in terms of the platform you're talking about. If we end up with a situation like we're in right now, is this curriculum, does it, and I don't know the terminology because I don't know technology, but would it slide very easily into whole group instruction online? Or, I mean, I'm envisioning something in my mind where, again, quoting Linda, where we don't end up that we're better off at the end of this pandemic than we are at when we began, and this kind of fluid curriculum that students can access, that teachers can access, that the two can access together. I mean, I'm sure y'all vetted this perfectly, but it's just something in the back of my mind. I keep thinking that we're never going to be back where we were before, and I still think in terms of the idea of students still being able to be part of a classroom, even if they're not visibly there. And again, I know none of that stuff has been vetted, but would that be compatible? I guess that's the main question I have. If everything we're talking about in terms of the platform that we use with the CARES money to the delivery of content for students that maybe are challenged to be in a physical classroom for a certain moment in time, if everything kind of works together.
That is correct. So I would say the resources that we have listed here are for all digital components that can support that on grade level instruction. What we will recommend in addition to this is a supplemental digital resource that provides acceleration and remediation. So in
the same product, will it be a supplement with that digital supplement that comes with this textbook?
We have not determined what the supplemental resource will be yet. We're still working with contracting. We did, in our RFP, review some materials that were great for a supplemental resource that are different from the resources that are listed, but we have not made a final determination because of course we're trying to negotiate price. And then of course I would want to be able to get feedback from our principals and our teachers around meeting those needs. But to answer your question, Dr. Maddox, it would probably be a different resource from the resources that are listed now.
Mr. Gaskins, I was going to add that in response to Mr. Davis and align with what Dr. Maddox just said. So I don't think that we will necessarily find a perfect product that's going to be perfect in the classroom and then automatically transfer to digital. So we have to vet products and determine what's best for our children in the ideal face-to-face, which is what I think you were getting at, Dr. Maddox, and then identify a strong supplemental program that reinforces and continues those standards. So we want that digital program to be standards-based and aligned to the content we're teaching, but it may not be the identical product that we use face-to-face because there are some things that are really stronger for face-to-face instruction versus being for digital instruction. I think that's what you were getting at, Dr. Maddox. So, you know, Mr. Davis, we probably won't have a product that this is what we're doing in class and that same product slides into at home. Instead, what we have to do is find a strong supplemental digital learning resource that teaches the same standards so that if we are back at home, we can continue still that instruction with remediation, acceleration, and on grade level instruction that's aligned to what they were learning, but it may not be exactly the Greg Davis instructional toolbox that's in the face-to-face. And then that same thing is available for digital. You know, unfortunately, this hasn't, because we haven't gotten to that place yet. Now, we may be there in 2 years or 3 years because the world is changing, but what they will have at home will be aligned to those same standards of instruction. Is that right, Mr. Gaskins?
That's correct. And in addition to that, we're also trying to find a product that does more than just provide the digital learning. We talked about formative assessments earlier. There are a lot of digital products that can track our students' growth over time, in addition to providing online learning and remote learning. So we're just trying to make sure that we find the right product that supports our students in multiple ways, that if we are out of school for an extended amount of time, it's still a great product to use. And if we're not out of school for an extended amount of time, it still has other uses and value. And we're trying to get the most for our money.
With that assessment tool, then that'll keep us from being where we are today, wondering what does that student growth look like? We will actually be able to measure what has happened, even if they were at home, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Sounds exciting.
Any other, we were on 9-7, right?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? We keep this on consent or?
I'm good.
Okay. 9-8. Any questions about this?
None.
Trying to look through, I don't think I see any hands or questions about the
I have a, at some point, I don't know when to ask this question, but it sounds like just listening to the conversation with Dr. Maddox and Mr. Davis that since I'm an adjunct at Athens Tech, of course, we have learning management repositories now, and that's kind of what the Blackboard system is. And while it's a front end to a lot of other applications, our textbooks and things are coming from the vendor into that system. Is there an attempt here at CCSC to look across all grade levels, all disciplines, I would say, and incorporate just one engine, I guess, that kind of looks like a dashboard, back to that bad word for you guys, but that puts together everything so that the child accessing it in their classroom would see that same font when they were home. Is that kind of where this is all going? Because there's a lot of technology integration here and immersion here.
So you're exactly right, Ms. Davis. We have that. So Google is our learning management system, and then we have an application called Clever, which provides single sign-on for our students. I think that we've learned more than ever that our teachers and students need to be well versed in that. Something that we've done at the district office is that all of our instructional services and some members of our student support services departments are getting Google certified. So they really know how to use those applications, because we have them, but we're not using them at their full capacity. And the other thing is about that single sign-on. Students use single sign-on in school, and then sometimes that doesn't transfer when they go home and work with their parents. But I think, like, especially our K through first grade teachers, our kindergarten and first grade teachers are learning more and more that it's really important to help our students be independent when they are signing on at school. So if they are at home for an extended amount of time, they already know how to do it. So I think there have been lessons learned that we have kind of done things for our students or not have explored all of the resources that we have as a district. But now that we've been forced to do that, I think that we're learning more and more, and that we will take advantage of our learning management system and our single sign-on for students.
Super, thank you.
You're
That
welcome.
gives that transparency to them, and it's seamless to them if they're accessing everything through a single platform. Starts to feel like it's all integrated, which is really good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So remain on consent?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Item 9.9.
I had some questions about this.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what this means, what this looks like practically for the students. Will they'll now be at one of the other two high schools? So I don't know if I could just get some more clarification on what this looks like.
I don't know if I want this to be on consent. That's a pretty big change for conceptually anyway.
Dr. Thomas, I think you're muted.
We can pull that from consent, and we've been working to actually on and off almost all day, actually trying to get a concise picture of what changes and what looks the same for next year. Mr. If it's okay with you, I can request from Dr. Gant that we remove it, and that way next week we can give them a very clear picture of what the instruction will look like for our students next year.
That'd be great.
Thank
That
you.
sounds exciting. Yep. This can be part of our transformation.
Yes, we've got it.
Yay.
Okay, so item 9.9 is being moved from consent. And Dr. Thomas, with your, as you all work to get a fuller picture and get all of those details together, I guess would you recommend us just sort of saving our questions for then, or if you all have something before then?
We can send you what we have before, but if you all also already have questions and you want to go ahead and send those to me, then we can include that to make sure what we present next week captures all the information you all would like to have.
Okay, that would be perfect.
Thank you.
Okay. Item 9.10, I'd asked Ms. Palmer and Dr. Thomas to add this, and that is we've been doing some work in small committees on different norms and things of that nature. This norm is one of the ones that we created during our board retreat. Now, I have since learned, thank you, Dr. Thomas and Dr. Myers, that we may actually need to go back or at least pull up also policy BBI to compare. And so that's a lesson or a reminder, for us as we're doing our norms to be sure that we're also placing them alongside the policy to be sure there are no.
I found a policy on school visits and a reg. And it wasn't BB, it was a K something. And I honestly, when I read that policy, I didn't see a real need for this norm. Unless
Ms. Davis, the K policy is visitors to schools as far as community visitors and others. The policy specific to board members visiting schools is BBI. There is a visitors to schools general policy in the K policies, but it really is about general public visitors, I believe.
Well, it's pretty specific and it talks about public visitors, but again, I'm not sure. Thank you for showing me BBI because I hadn't looked at that. I really think this is kind of redundant to that particular policy. So could I just ask that we pull that one and look at that integration between that and the other two? It's kind of like the inclement weather thing. You know, if it's a school visit, it's a school visit. And so I don't know that the board members, this doesn't tell me that we have any special privilege. And the process is exactly what is mentioned in, I think it's K something. If I can get my screen to reduce, I can actually tell you. What is it?
It's KM.
And there's an R a reg that goes with it. Yep. Thank you. KM and KMR1. It has been my experience that this is how I'm treated when I go to the schools. Whoever invites me notifies their principal, and the principal notifies Dr. Thomas, and that's how that's worked. So I'm not sure we need a different one.
I think the reason to have the norm is because not everybody really understood that, or that there wasn't a consistent way in which people were either accepting invitations or not accepting invitations, or I don't think it says anything different from the policy, but just clarifies a procedure for what we need to do. And also I think that people, there's been a lot of talk, not so much lately, but previously, about whether or not board members were allowed in schools or not. And so I think it helps to clarify.
That's just yes. Okay. I certainly welcome your opinion, but again, if we're trying to reduce the number of things that we've got to lay hands on to understand who we are and what we do, I know that we've not talked about this policy in relation to our school visits. So I don't know, maybe I'm missing something.
I think you're missing something a little bit, Linda. I don't want to disagree with you, but I mean, I do think it needs to be made consistent with the policy, but I think we wanted to go a little bit beyond the policy to, again, what are the norms? And, you know, we spent a good amount of time during our retreat talking about the importance of establishing norms, which are
that's
behaviors.
In the absence of policy, is it not?
I'm sorry?
Are norms in the absence of policy?
They're in addition, they complement the policy, is my understanding.
Yeah, I think the same, in that the policy is sort of the skeleton of it, but the norms are a more like operating manual of how to do something.
Yeah, I think just to clarify that, I think you said the right word, Kara, in terms of like a manual. Because I think, you know, like in human resources, you know, they have a manual that we don't see and we don't need to see about how they hire and you know, kind of the minutia of that whole process. You know, the finance department. And I think what we're talking about is clarification in this board manual, which is what I would call the norms that we're talking about, as to exactly how something is how a board member is to, in this case, visit a school. What is the exact protocols? And I think the policy states that a board member is encouraged to do that, but it doesn't really say how it's done. So I'm all in favor of pulling it for further discussion in this particular protocol, but I do think it's important for us to as we move forward, to try to, those areas that have created conflict in the past, rightly or wrongly, I think that we need to address them. Because I think that's what, if we learn anything from the Con Ed document, is that, you know, if we have a misunderstanding among us, then it can come to bite us. And so I think this is a good opportunity for us to sit down in those areas that have had discrepancies in terms of how people have viewed them, that we flesh it out in a very respectful way, but come to a consensus that is very specific. So that's what I would call the board manual.
But now we're getting a definition for norms. And that helps me, because I didn't understand why, even in the policy that was presented several months ago, that it seemed to be things that were taken from policy, but and that left me with the impression that we're cherry picking, saying these are the policies we're going to follow, and the rest of them we're not. And so I'm not sure how I integrate the norms with the policies if you're telling me that we have a visitation policy, and it doesn't, even though it doesn't specify board members, I mean, it definitely would include board members. And I would ask us to look at that policy to make sure that we are not saying something contrary to the policy in this norms protocol document. I don't know that it doesn't lend that much clarity for me, but that's just me. I'm good.
And so maybe we should pull it from consent. And I do think it sounds like the work that should be done with it is simply looking at it alongside policy. And so I would ask that we pull it from consent, but keep it there, because I do think that we need a set of norms. And certainly we don't want to restate what's already in policy, but I think it goes back to the original question: does it need to be policy? You know, if BBI, the board staff relations, and it sort of hits on this, do we need it in policy and norms? I would argue.
Does it conflict actually too? Because when I'm just looking at the norms that's on the screen now, and it says notify the superintendent, superintendent notifies the building leader. Well, the policy says that the principal is to be notified, and the principal has to approve that person coming into the building, and the principal, as the building leader, then is engaged in this. So,
but Linda, that's for outside visitors, not board members. That's why K doesn't apply. That's why we have to.
Why do we have to have a different rule for outside board members? I mean, as board members, we're board members, but we don't have any more privilege than the public.
No, I think we actually have less.
Yeah,
and I think that's the point, is that we have to communicate through the superintendent. And that's why this is necessary for us to say that we're going to notify the superintendent. And if a principal just invites us, then we can't just go. We have to tell the superintendent.
But the policy says the principal notifies the superintendent, or the principal is responsible for that communication. It's not.
No, but it does for the visitors, for community visitors, but for the board, there's in that BI, it says board staff relations. And so I think we are different from the community members.
And so I would propose us just thinking about keeping it on the agenda. We did spend hours as a board discussing the need for norms in our last GSBA training. And I think they were very supportive. I think the only work that has to be done here is deciding, is it complementary to the policy or do we need the policy as well? If the, you know, like where does it fit? But I think it needs to be on the agenda, and I think we're gonna have to get to a place where we have some, you know, we all have some operational definitions about how particular behavior should look. And so I do think that this is one that needs to remain on the agenda. Maybe between now and then, if we could all take a hard look at policy, and the policy BBI is not long, but just, you know, maybe look just to be sure that the norms capture the essence of that policy.
And that they don't conflict with the other one.
Well, I mean, I do think it's important, and I agree with you, Lakeisha, but I do think it's important that we see that with that, if we pull up KM and begin to take KM and then BBI and the norms and try to mesh them together, KM is not, it's not appropriate for us. I'm not saying we may need to review KM, but it's not relevant to this to us.
Thinking along the lines of BBI, since BBI is specifically about board and staff relations.
Right.
So then my question would be, is I do want you to look at KM, since we didn't look at it because we weren't thinking it was about us. Is there anything in there that we wouldn't be able to do any of these things either? And so do these things need to be captured also in our norms? Again, we're board members, that's special, but when we walk into a school, we have the privacy rules that we have to observe in terms of our students and our interactions with our students. We have to make sure that we have not violated any federal laws. And I'm not suggesting that as board members, we know those laws or those rules. And so again, I'm just asking us to look at the whole picture, that's all. And if that's too far out of scope, you know, I've been wrong before.
I think between now and next week, if we could take a look at BBI, and if you feel compelled, certainly Ms. Davis and others, to take a look at KM. And if there is any communication around these norms or any suggestions and things like that, that we feel like can be changed within the week that don't really change the core, the essence, we can then decide to adopt it as our norm. And if we need to pull it from the agenda next week or table it until
I'd just like to take it off consent. And I think that'll help.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can take it off consent, but I also want us to have some direction. I don't want us to get caught up in, you know, like 6 months from now, we're still trying to adopt the first norm. I think we do have to have a level of urgency, but also be intentional and thorough. So I definitely appreciate your comments, Ms. Davis and Mr. Davis. But between now and next week, if we could take just a look at policy and to see if there are any very specific recommendations for the norm.
And so, you know, when we put the segue into this, but when we put the things that we volunteered to research for our norms, the first thing I did on the one that I chose is I'm going through policy, and then I'm going through law as it's identified in the policy before I even began to put together a document like this. And it's frightening to me that I'm doing it in a vacuum, but that's okay. I'll start there and get my draft into to my committee that we can look at it. But even to have us articulate our checklist to make sure that we're not bringing a norm to the board that hasn't been vetted through policy or through the law, to make sure that it makes sense for us to do that would be helpful, so that we don't have to have this conversation over and over again. So maybe we can get policy, Dawn, bless your heart, who's leaving us, get the attorney to look at what we're putting into the norms to make sure that we're not violating some law as we try and craft these. Would be helpful to me as a process. if we all did the same thing.
Dr. Myers and Mr. Pruitt, is that something that you all would be willing to do, at least be in on our communications as we work as smaller committees to create drafts to bring to the board? And, you know,
Just to review the drafts.
And if I could jump in, actually, this is the first time I had seen this one, and so I did notice two much narrower comments. One, there's a reference in there to inviting other board members. Remember, if 5 or more of you show up, we have a quorum and a meeting, so that's probably something you need to address somehow. The other observation I'd make is that, especially with the Cognia situation right now, when you look back at the decisions about board members visiting schools, there's been an over enthusiastic interpretation of, well, that just means board members can't ever go to schools. Actually, it was a much narrower focus. It was that board members should not be giving direction to building level personnel, be it the super principal or anybody below. So this might be a good opportunity to add something to that norm, just to signal that you're aware of that.
Yes, could we have that language did that go back to a ruling or something else, Mike?
It goes back to some of those decisions with Clayton County and the other districts. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love for that to be codified in some way, because I feel like we spend a lot of board time re-arguing the case of whether we can ever set foot on a campus or not. And so if we could just put it down somewhere, whether it belongs in policy or norms, just somewhere, please.
I'll be glad to provide some wording between now and next week.
Great.
So then our process will be that we would draft our norms as this has been drafted, and then make sure that they get the eyes of the attorney, and our policy coordinator takes a look at it as well. Is that a friendly amendment to our process?
sure, yes, I think that would be great. Thank you, Ms. Davis. And then Dr. Yeager, you being on policy and as well as working with some norms as well, and working closely with Dr. Myers, just having that extra set of eyes would be great.
Yep.
So we'll pull this from consent. We'll see if any, what work can be done with it between now and next week. And if not, we'll table it and continue to work on it with the goal of bringing it or a norm back for our June meeting. Any other questions or recommendations around this?
Thank you.
I think that brings us to adjournment. Is that correct?
Really? I've got ice cream waiting.
Yes, ma'am.
I motion to adjourn.
All right, at 9:07, we have a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Worthy. Any further questions? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? I didn't see any opposed. Right. We are adjourned at 9:08 p.m.
Thank you so much.